The story of the Second Crusade begins not in glory, but in catastrophe. In the winter of 1144, on the cold frontier of the Latin East, the proud walls of Edessa collapsed under the relentless siege of Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. Edessa was not simply another fortress. It was the first of the Crusader states, a symbolic outpost of Christendom carved into the fabric of the Near East after the First Crusade's astonishing triumph. Its loss struck like a thunderclap across the world of Latin Christendom. For the first time, the seemingly permanent advance of the crusading movement was thrown into reverse. As word of the disaster crept westward, panic spread. Edessa had been thought of as a bulwark, the farthest eastern shield of the Christian frontier. Now it was gone. Towns and villages whispered of massacres, of captives dragged into slavery, of relics lost forever. And with those whispers came the gnawing fear: if Edessa could fall, so too might Antioch, Jerusalem, or even the entire fragile experiment of the Latin East. In 1145, Pope Eugene III received the grim envoys from the East. They begged him to summon Christendom once more, to call upon warriors, pilgrims, and kings to rescue the Holy Land. The Pope issued a new bull, Quantum Predecessors, invoking the memory of Urban II and the First Crusade, promising the same remission of sins for those who would march eastward. Yet a papal decree alone was not enough. To ignite the hearts of Christendom required fire, and the man chosen to spark it was Bernard of Clairvaux, the most charismatic preacher of his age. In March of 1146, a vast crowd gathered at Vézelay in Burgundy. There, upon a wooden platform, Bernard rose to speak. His words were like thunder. He reminded the faithful of their duty to defend Christ's heritage, of the blood already spilled in Jerusalem, and of the eternal reward promised to those who bore the cross. So moved were the multitudes that when the supply of cloth crosses was exhausted, Bernard himself tore strips from his own robe to satisfy the demand. Among those who stepped forward were none other than Louis VII of France and his radiant queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Before the assembled masses, they knelt and took the cross. Soon after, Conrad III, King of Germany, followed suit, committing his vast empire to the cause. For the first time in the history of crusading, crowned monarchs of Europe themselves would march at the head of armies, not merely knights and barons. It seemed that the movement had reached a new level, one that promised unprecedented strength and divine favor. Across Europe, nobles, peasants, and knights pledged themselves to the cause. Villages emptied of able-bodied men. Songs of holy war resounded through cathedrals and town squares. The crusade had been reborn. But beneath the fervor, shadows already gathered. This was no longer the world of 1096. The Latin states were no longer novelties but embattled kingdoms with their own rivalries and vulnerabilities. The Byzantine Empire, still smarting from the chaos of the First Crusade, viewed the arrival of vast Western armies with suspicion rather than welcome. And in the Islamic world, something was changing too. The death of Zengi in 1146 had not ended the threat. Instead, it passed the torch to his son, Nur al-Din, a man of stern piety and clear purpose who sought to unite the Muslim world against the invaders. Thus the scene was set. Europe's greatest kings had vowed to march. Monks and clerics sang of triumph. And yet, destiny waited on the long roads through Byzantium and Anatolia, where hope would wither into disillusion, and dreams of conquest would end in the bitter orchards of Damascus. The summer of 1147 saw the movement take form. From every corner of the German lands, Conrad's host poured eastward, an immense tide of armored men, banners snapping in the wind, priests chanting blessings over the columns of knights. France too stirred, as Louis and Eleanor led their own procession of nobles, their retinues glimmering in the sun like a river of steel. The roads of Europe filled with pilgrims turned warriors, bound not for Rome or Santiago but for Jerusalem. Yet before the Holy Land stood Constantinople, jewel of the Byzantine world. The Emperor Manuel I Komnenos ruled a city of marble palaces, golden domes, and centuries of suspicion toward the Latins who had come before. He remembered well the chaos of the First Crusade, when ungovernable masses had trampled Byzantine soil, plundering as often as they prayed. And now, before his gates, stood not ragged peasants but kings, Conrad of Germany with tens of thousands of warriors, soon to be followed by Louis of France. Tension flared almost at once. The Byzantines, wary of invasion cloaked as pilgrimage, hastened to ferry the Germans across the Bosporus, lest their encampment outside Constantinople turn into occupation. Rumors spread among the Crusaders that Manuel plotted against them, that he preferred the Turks to his fellow Christians. The Greeks, for their part, feared that these unruly Westerners might seize lands that had once been imperial and carve them into new Latin states. Trust, the invisible currency of alliances, was in short supply. From the moment the Germans set foot in Asia Minor, the dangers of this march revealed themselves. Conrad pressed his forces inland, toward the familiar routes of the First Crusade. But the Seljuk Turks were ready. Their Sultan, Mezid I, knew the terrain intimately, the burning plateaus, the winding passes, the parched distances between wells. His horse archers shadowed the German columns, cutting off stragglers, burning villages, striking swiftly and vanishing into the dust. In October of 1147, near Dorylaeum, Conrad's army suffered disaster. Surrounded by elusive cavalry, battered by arrows, and tortured by thirst, the German host broke. Thousands perished. Conrad himself was wounded. Survivors staggered back toward Nicaea, their dream of glory reduced to a nightmare of hunger and blood. Meanwhile, the French, following in the Germans' footsteps, fared little better. Louis VII led his men with sincere piety but little military genius. The rocky terrain, the endless skirmishes, the heat and exhaustion ground his army down. Crossing Anatolia was no pilgrimage of triumph but a gauntlet of attrition. By the time the battered remnants of the two royal hosts reached the safety of Byzantine or coastal ports, they were diminished, disheartened, and already fractured in unity. Still, they pressed onward. Ships carried the French from Italia to the Levant, while Conrad, recovering from his wounds, followed later. At last, in the spring of 1148, the crusading monarchs stood upon the soil of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Bells rang in the Holy City. The young King Baldwin III and his formidable mother, Queen Melisende, welcomed their royal allies. Pilgrims filled the streets, convinced that with such kings assembled, God's favor would surely crown their enterprise. But beneath the incense and ceremony lay a troubling truth. The original goal, the recapture of Edessa, was already beyond reach. The city had been destroyed, its walls dismantled, its people scattered. To march there now would mean death in hostile terrain, with no fortress left to reclaim. The crusade, born in response to Edessa, found itself without an attainable target. So the lords of the Latin East, together with the visiting kings, convened a grand council. In the vaulted halls of Jerusalem, they weighed their options. Antioch was too distant, Aleppo too strong. Ascalon, the Egyptian-held fortress threatening the kingdom's southern flank, tempted some, but it was a long-term goal, not an immediate prize. Then another idea emerged, bold and intoxicating: Damascus. Damascus was not merely a city, it was one of the richest, most ancient capitals of the region. Its capture would secure a fertile base for the Crusaders, fracture Muslim unity, and present Christendom with a dazzling trophy. For Louis and Conrad, still smarting from the humiliations of Anatolia, the chance to win such a prize seemed heaven-sent. Plans were drawn. Armies were summoned. And in July of 1148, the Crusade set its eyes on Damascus. In the height of summer, the crusading hosts marched north toward Damascus. Dust rose in great plumes from the tramp of armored feet and hooves, shimmering in the heat of July. To the weary men who had survived the march through Anatolia, Damascus promised redemption. This was the jewel of Syria, a city of gardens and orchards, of markets that overflowed with silks and spices, a place whose very name carried the weight of centuries. To seize Damascus would be to carve a victory so bright that all the failures along the road would be forgotten. On July 24, 1148, the Crusaders reached the city. Their leaders, Louis of France, Conrad of Germany, Baldwin of Jerusalem, chose to attack from the west. Here lay the famed gardens of Damascus, a belt of orchards watered by irrigation canals, dense with fruit trees and shaded paths. At first glance, it seemed a gift: cover for the army, plentiful water, food plucked from the very branches. But this paradise was also a labyrinth. Narrow paths hindered the advance, and behind every grove could lurk defenders. The first assaults met fierce resistance. Archers rained shafts from behind garden walls. Stones and missiles flew from hastily fortified towers. The defenders fought with a fury born of desperation, for Damascus was no ordinary fortress, it was the heart of their world. Yet the Crusaders pressed on, hacking through orchards, breaking dikes, tearing down barriers. By the end of the first day, the western approaches of the city trembled under their weight. For a brief moment, victory seemed possible. But then, doubt began to gnaw. Supplies were not limitless. The orchards that offered cover also trapped the army in close quarters where every step forward came at a cost. The commanders disagreed over the next move. Some argued that the western gardens were too dangerous, too easy for the defenders to exploit. Others warned that hesitation itself would doom them. In the end, a fateful decision was made. the Crusaders would abandon the western side and shift their attack to the eastern approaches. It was a disaster. Unlike the fertile, crowded west, the eastern side of Damascus lay bare and exposed. Here the defenders could see every movement, could rain arrows and javelins upon the advancing Crusaders without hindrance. The orchards that had slowed the Christians now became the shield of the Damascenes. Within hours, morale plummeted. As the Crusaders struggled to regroup, news spread that Nur al-Din himself was approaching with reinforcements from Aleppo. Panic crept into the camp. If the relief army arrived, the Crusaders would be caught between city walls and enemy cavalry. Whispers of betrayal circulated. Had certain lords of Jerusalem urged the shift to the east for their own gain? Had the Byzantines secretly counseled Damascus of the Crusaders' plans? The kings hesitated. For 5 days, they battered themselves against the walls. 5 days of frustration, heat, and dwindling supplies. On the night of July 28th, the decision was made. The crusade would retreat. The withdrawal was chaotic, bitter, and humiliating. The proud hosts that had set forth to reclaim Edessa and secure Christendom now slunk back from Damascus, their banners drooping, their men muttering in anger. All unity dissolved. The French turned toward home, the Germans nursed their wounds, the barons of Jerusalem fumed at wasted effort. What had begun with fire and glory had ended in shame and failure. The orchards of Damascus had devoured the Second Crusade. The retreat from Damascus sent shockwaves across Christendom. Word traveled swiftly, carried by pilgrims, merchants, and clerics, until even the most remote village church in France or Germany spoke of the failure. The great kings had marched with pomp and thunder, but they returned with nothing but bitter tales. The dream of reclaiming Edessa was gone, and the proud hope of a triumphant new crusade lay in ruins. For the Muslims of the Near East, the outcome was a revelation. They had watched the mightiest princes of the West march against them, and yet, with determination and unity, they had prevailed. Damascus remained free, its orchards untrodden, its walls unbroken. This was more than a military victory. It was a psychological turning point. If the Second Crusade had succeeded, Muslim rulers might have continued to quarrel among themselves. Instead, its failure gave men like Nur al-Din of Aleppo a chance to rise as champions of a united jihad. Out of this new unity would come his successor, Saladin, whose name would one day dominate the chronicles of East and West alike. Back in Europe, the reckoning began. Some blamed the Byzantines, accusing Emperor Manuel of treachery, of leading the Crusaders astray in Anatolia. Others accused the barons of Jerusalem of cowardice, of abandoning the assault on Damascus too soon. Louis of France and Conrad of Germany returned to their kingdoms diminished in prestige, their reputation stained. The crusading ideal had not died, but it had been shaken to its core. Even Bernard of Clairvaux, who had preached the crusade with such fiery conviction, found himself under fire. Critics accused him of promising victory as if ordained by God. Bernard defended himself with sorrow, insisting that the crusade had failed not because the mission was wrong, but because the sins of the crusaders had brought divine punishment. His sermons took on a darker tone, filled with lament rather than triumph. The age of unquestioned enthusiasm for crusading would never be the same again. The failure also carried consequences beyond the Holy Land. In Iberia, the Christian kingdoms of Spain had tied their efforts to the crusading spirit. During the years of the Second Crusade, they launched campaigns against Muslim strongholds in the peninsula, notably taking Lisbon in 1147 with the help of passing Crusader fleets. In the Baltic, too, crusading energy spilled outward, directed against pagan peoples along the shores of the North Sea. Though the main expedition to the Levant had ended in disgrace, the idea of crusade adapted, spreading into new theatres where the papacy could channel militant piety. For Eleanor of Aquitaine, the crusade was also a turning point. She had marched across continents, seen battle, endured hardship, and quarreled openly with her husband, King Louis. Their relationship fractured under the strain. Within a few years, their marriage was annulled, and Eleanor would wed Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England. Through her, the failure of the Second Crusade was woven into the larger tapestry of European politics, shaping dynasties and rivalries for generations to come. The Muslims remembered the Crusaders' retreat from Damascus as a triumph. The Christians remembered it as a bitter shame. Yet both understood its importance. The Second Crusade had revealed the limits of Western power when divided, when pride overshadowed strategy, when faith was not matched with prudence. It had also revealed the rising strength of the Islamic world, where men like Nur al-Din were beginning to envision something greater than defense, the recovery of Jerusalem itself. Thus, The Second Crusade closed not with the sound of trumpets, but with silence and regret. But history does not pause. The seeds of failure in Damascus would bear fruit decades later, when the armies of Saladin swept across the Levant and shattered the kingdom of Jerusalem at the horns of Hattin. The Second Crusade, in its shame, was the shadow cast before that storm. And so the story ends, not in triumph, but in warning. A reminder that faith without unity falters, that pride blinds the eyes of kings, and that in the struggle between civilizations, even the mightiest armies can stumble in the orchards of Damascus.